2 days ago, President Trump tweeted that the United States is, quote, ill-prepared for this invasion of migrants coming from South America. But now, just as the first caravans have begun to arrive at the U.S.-Mexico border in Tijuana, some of the 5,800 active duty troops President Trump ordered there are set to come home. Joining us now, retired Army Colonel and former Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, Lawrence Wilkerson. He's a professor of government and public policy at the College of William and Mary. Colonel, good morning. Thank you for being with us. You and two colleagues have a new piece out in the New York Times titled "Trump's Border Stunt is a Profound Betrayal of Our Military." And you write of that policy this: Mr. Trump's announcement and the deployment that followed were probably perfectly legal. But we are a bipartisan threesome with decades of experience in and with the Pentagon, and to us, this act creates a dangerous precedent. We fear this was lost in the public hand-wringing over the decision, so let us be clear. The president used America's military forces not against any real threat, but as toy soldiers with the intent of manipulating a domestic midterm election outcome, an unprecedented use of the military by a sitting president. Generously, some aspects of the deployment are at least defensible, but one is not. And that aspect is the domestic political use, or rather misuse, of the military. The deployment is a stunt, a dangerous one, and in our view, a misuse of the military that should have led Mr. Mattis to consider resigning instead of acceding to this blatant politicization of America's military. So, Colonel, flesh that out a little more for us, if you would. We've been asking that question all along with respect to the service of General Mattis, where he's been in this process.
First of all, let me say that I'm very happy, although the point you just made is relevant. They're coming home now, because some of these troops will now get to spend Thanksgiving with their families, and I suspect that some of them haven't done that for a long time.
Yeah.
The second point, the more important point, I think, with regard to your question, is that political stunts are things that happen. I mean, politics and the military are integrally interwoven. Let's take my old boss, who was a political stunt master of the very first order of magnitude. Remember that TV? Remember when he said to the American people about the first Gulf War, first we're going to cut it off and then we're going to kill it. But that was a use of politics, if you will, for the right purposes, to get the American people behind a United Nations Security Council resolution to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, to reverse the aggression, something we set in the 1950s the UN up to do. And we did that, and then we left. So that was a political stunt, as it were, that was in consonance with the use of the military by tradition and custom and precedent. To use the military in order to influence the midterm elections on your party's behalf, which is precisely why Donald Trump did what he did, is unconscionable. And it is a violation of all the military custom and tradition that's made this country great and made the military in it great. So it's a very dangerous precedent to set. Just imagine, for example, that suddenly Donald Trump sees terrorists in America, domestic terrorists, or Hezbollah, or Hamas, or whatever he might call them. We now have an addition to the 2011 National Defense Authorization Act that allows the president to suspend posse comitatus, which is the law that says you can't use the American military for domestic law enforcement unless there are certain circumstances pertinent, like the nation's collapsing. Well, now the president can call those forces out if he, quote, sees material support to terrorism or to suppress that support, unquote. This is a very dangerous precedent to set. Using the armed forces of the United States for domestic political reasons is and should be verboten.
Colonel Wilkerson, I'm sure you saw when General Mattis visited the border last week, he addressed the troops, and he was asked, what are we doing here? And he said, well, in the short term, you're laying down that wire. In the long term, we don't quite know, to paraphrase what he said. He couldn't give an answer to that question. So I think what a lot of people are wondering as they think about guardrails around this presidency, they thought that General Mattis perhaps would be one of the strongest of those. And I understand chain of command. I understand that the president is the commander-in-chief. But is there something more, or should there have been something more that General Mattis might have done here?
I really empathize and sympathize with General Mattis. He is in an untenable position, and I know what he's telling himself. Remember, I served Colin Powell during some very difficult times. I know in my heart, in my soul, that Colin Powell probably always thought about periodically at least, thought about, what if I should leave? Why shouldn't I leave? And I know what the rationalization was, and I don't use that term in a pejorative sense. If I leave, someone worse will replace me. If I leave, sanity leaves. If I leave, common sense leaves. And that's what Jim is telling himself right now. I know I have no right to crawl inside Jim Mattis's mind, but I've been in minds like that, as it were. I've seen these kinds of circumstances at the highest levels of power, and you tell yourself you're indispensable. And in many respects, perhaps, given the circumstances the nation confronts today with this president, maybe he is. And so, as I said, I can understand why he would not leave, although at the same time, I wish he'd make a more powerful statement.
Well, sir, Mika Brzezinski here, Colonel, if I could take that point that you're making a step further and help us understand what might be happening, maybe perhaps some peace of mind. If you're doing the math and saying, if I leave, common sense leaves, so I'm going to stay, but then you're carrying out something that is clearly not common sense, something that is clearly not addressing a threat,
you also
something that is a political ploy. But should you be?
I
mean, tell me what should be.
Too. I mean, let's face it, we went to the United Nations on 5 February 2003 and presented a case for Iraq's possession of weapons of mass destruction that both of us felt was suspicious. But we have been confronted by the principal intelligence agencies of the United States, France, Germany, Jordan, Israel, and so forth in a concerted way. And who are we to dispute that? So we carried out that mission. So
what were you what would you say if you were in General Mattis's position? We are confronted by this, therefore I'm going to carry out. What's the threat? What would you have done if you were in charge of sending troops to the border?
Well, I'm a passionate dude, Mika. I would have resigned. I should have resigned before I went to the UN with Colin Powell. I will regret that to my grave. But I also am a practical person who's been at the highest levels of power, and I can tell you immediately that any resignation such as that, Jim Mattis now, for example, lasts about 2 seconds in the media. Maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks at most. And then we'll go on to the same rat race we're in right now with accusations on both sides of the political aisle and nobody believing the other. So it's easy to reconcile yourself to the fact that you are the person who is maintaining in a very, very dangerous position, if you will, sobriety and sanity. And you stay and you weather the reputational damage that does to you. And I think General Mattis is having massive reputational damage done to himself, and I suspect it will increase before either he or the president decides to terminate the relationship.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson with some clear thoughts this morning. Thank you so much for being with us, Colonel. We appreciate it. Still ahead on Morning Joe, we'll get a live report from the only state that still has a Senate seat up for grabs this election cycle. That is Mississippi. And the fact Democrats still have a chance there, already a major story. Morning Joe's coming right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.